Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my favorite fantasy romance duets. Alright guys, so I recently posted a fantasy romance standalone rec video, and on that video there were a few comments that requested a fantasy romance duet rec video. So this way, if you don't want to commit to an entire fantasy romance series, but you still want a really good story. So I put together a list of some of my absolute favorite fantasy romance duets. There is a mix of YA, also some dark fantasy romance, and then just adult fantasy romance. So I'm so excited to talk about these books with you guys. Now, if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram, Goodreads, and Patreon, all linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about these fantasy romance duets. So starting off with young adult fantasy romance, first up we have One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This is a gothic young adult romantasy that was gaining a lot of hype last year. So the story is following Espeth, and she lives in this mist-shrouded town of Blunder. And when she was very young, she touched a magical tarot card that ended up infecting her with this monster that she refers to as a nightmare that lives inside her head. Now, if anyone was to find out this monster exists, she would be killed, so she has to keep this a secret, which is very difficult. And one day when she is out wandering, she runs into a highwayman who happens to be the king's nephew, and he is up to no good, and he ends up pulling our main character along with him. They now have to collect 12 magical tarot cards to try to overtake the crown, from what I remember, and the story goes from there. So unfortunately, I never read the second book in this duet. I wasn't crazy about the first one, but it does have very good reviews, and it definitely had those dark gothic vibes. So highly recommend. And this next young adult duology, I will admit I did DNF. However, I know so many people adore this duology. There was a time I could not go on Bookstagram without seeing this duology everywhere. So it is Divine Rivals. I did start this first book. I just wasn't really feeling it. It has a very historical fiction type feel to it. So I did DNF, but the story is following Iris. And Iris's brother has gone off to fight in this war between gods. So while this is going on, Iris is trying to procure a job, I think, as a columnist. And while doing so, she is writing all of these letters to her brother that are just very heartfelt. And somehow her brother is not receiving these letters. It's actually her rival. And I believe at some point there are magical typewriters that connect each other. I'm not really sure. I didn't get that far into the book. Just know this series has amazing reviews. It is only 2 books. Now, I do know it seems some people kind of felt a little let down by the second book, but once again, I have not read it. But if that plot sounds interesting to you, I definitely think this is worth giving a shot. And last up for YA duologies, we have These Hollow Vows. This is actually the second book, These Twisted Bonds. So in this story, we are following Bree, and Bree lives in the human realm with her younger sister, and Bree absolutely detests the Fae. And one day, Bree discovers that her sister is missing and learns that she has been captured by the Unseelie Court and is being held prisoner. So Bree will do absolutely anything to get her sister back, and that includes agreeing to sneak into the Seelie Court to steal 3 magical items. And then the story really progresses from there. There is a bit of a love triangle, but if you enjoy A Court of Thorns and Roses, this has a lot of similarities, but much faster pacing, and it's only 2 books. So definitely check this out if you haven't yet. And moving into adult fantasy romance, first up we have Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. Now, this is set in the Crown of Nyaxia world, where there are other books that have been published that are set in the same world, but Serpent and the Wings of Night and Ashes and the Star-Cursed King can be read as a standalone duet. So I absolutely love this duet. In the story, we are following Raeta, and at the very beginning, she is orphaned as a very young girl. So she's found by the king of the vampires, who brings her to his home and raises her as his ward. Now, she has had a very dangerous upbringing, being surrounded by vampires. So when she comes of age, she wants to join the Kajari, which is a fight to the death, and the winner of this tournament will be granted a wish by the goddess Nyaxia herself. Now, Oriah is very much outmatched because she's going to be going up against a bunch of other vampires, so she has to team up with a vampire from a rival clan and a few others, and the story really goes from there, but it is so good. I absolutely love this, so highly recommend. Next up, we have A King So Cold and the Stray Prince by Ella Fields. So this is a dark fantasy romance, and in this story, we are following a ruthless Fae queen whose kingdom is on the brink of war after her husband's horrible betrayal has left her with a frozen heart and him with absolutely no memories. So when she discovers that her husband, who once again does not remember her, plans on remarrying, she decides that is not okay, locks him up, puts him in the dungeons, and then we kind of look back at what led our main character to become this way, to be seen as so ruthless. So it's very much a villain origin story, just seeing everything that has led her down this path. And I will say the romance was very unexpected. I absolutely loved it. And the second book, The Stray Prince, while darker, please check trigger warnings. It was much darker than I anticipated when I first picked it up. I loved it. It was angsty. I loved we go to a new location. I love the new location. Overall, just one of my absolute favorite fantasy romance duets. And next up we have another dark fantasy romance duet by Ella Fields. It is Nectar of the Wicked. Now, I have talked about this duology at length on my channel, so I'm going to keep this very brief. But if you're unfamiliar, we are following a changeling fae who has spent the last 20 years wondering who she is, where she comes from. So she's been raised by a human guardian who is desperate to find her real daughter because her daughter was swapped with our main character when they were babies. So one day while she is trying to discover where her daughter is, she is killed. So now our main character has no idea what to do. She doesn't know her real name, she has no idea where she comes from, and then a mysterious wicked fae shows up on her doorstep and says, "Hey, I have the answers that you are seeking. If you agree to marry me and move to the Fae realm, I can help you figure all this out." So she agrees, and it's their romance, and I loved it. It's so dark, and I will say, the MMC does some deplorable things to the main character. He has to do a lot of groveling, but overall, I loved this romance. Once again, please check triggers. It is dark, and I feel like this book really doesn't give you like a dark vibe, but trust me, the second book too, super dark. But I love the way Ella Fields writes female protagonists. I think she just makes them so strong. I love her. I love her writing. So please, if you have not read this or A King So Cold, definitely check them out. And next up, we have Peaches and Honey. This is another book that I've talked about quite a lot. I did not realize this is actually a duology. I thought this was the first book in a series. So this is the first book in a adult fantasy romance duology. And the plot is very similar to The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. We are following this young woman who's been ostracized by society due to her vitiligo. And one day she passes a peasant and she shows them kindness, and in return, they give her a peach. And when she bites into the peach, she realizes that it's actually magical, and she is now immortal. So this book is really just following our main character as she goes through life and sees all of the nuances of humanity, both the good and the bad. And while all this is going on, there are other immortal beings that she has a connection with. And I just loved this. The writing was very poetic. And I feel like I've said this in almost every single review of this book. I don't typically gravitate towards very whimsical writing. I don't mind writing to be a bit more blunt, but with this, it just made this book so much more immersive and beautiful. And if you liked The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, I think you will love this. Personally, I love this book more. I just thought it was so well done. I also like the romance a lot more in this book. So if you read this, let me know what you think. I am patiently waiting for the second book to release via audio. And next up, we have Radiance by Grace Draven. Now, a lot of people, including myself, believed that this was a standalone, but there actually is a second book you can read after. Now, I have not read that second book, but I definitely want to pick it up soon. But if you do want to read this as a standalone, you 100% can. It does have an HEA. Now, the story is following Brishin, and he is the spare prince of the Kai people, and he agrees to an arranged marriage with Ildigo, a human noblewoman. And they're doing this in order to form a political alliance. But if you can see, they look completely different. And upon meeting each other, they just absolutely detest the way each other looks. So as they slowly get to know each other, I think their love really just transcends appearance and they start to really just have this beautiful bond. And this is very much like not enemies to lovers, but just non-interest to lovers, and it's one of my absolute favorites. So if you have not picked up Grace Draven, highly recommend checking her out. She's one of my favorite fantasy romance authors, and I am very much looking forward to reading the second book. And next up, we have The Ever King and the Ever Queen by L.J. Andrews. So this is an adult fantasy romance that is set on the water, so if you enjoy pirate fantasy, highly recommend. But in this story, we are following Eric, and Eric is the scarred and vengeful ruler of the Ever Kingdom, and he has been plotting revenge against the man who has trapped him beneath the seas and has killed his father. And one day, the unsuspecting daughter of his enemy unleashes him and sets him free. So he decides he is going to use her to get revenge on her father, and it's their romance, and it's so good. If you've read the Shatter Me series, the main guy in this is essentially Aaron Warner, but make him a pirate. Like, he has all of that swagger, and I loved him so much. So this is one of my favorite duets. I still haven't read The Mist Thief, which is a companion novel to this duet. So if you want to stay in this world, there are other books, but you can read The Ever King and The Ever Queen as a standalone duet. And next up, we have Black Sunshine by Carissa Halley. This is more of a vampire meets witchy fantasy paranormal romance, but it's my absolute favorite by Carissa Halley. Carissa Halley, by the way, has a lot of paranormal and fantasy romance duets that are amazing. This one just happens to be my favorite. But in this story, we are following Lenore, and Lenore believed she was an ordinary girl that was about to turn, I believe, 21 at the start of this, and she's supposed to go on a vacation with her parents to the middle of nowhere in this cabin. And before she can do that, she is captured by a mysterious man named Absalon, who informs Lenore that she is actually half vampire, and her parents are actually witches that plan on killing her when she comes of age and turns. So she has to decide if she believes him, and it's their romance. It will give you all of like the adult Twilight vibes, but also very, very spicy. Also definitely check trigger warnings because there were some things that happened in this I was not expecting. Like much darker than I thought. But I love Absalon as a character. He's just the coolest. So definitely if you like dark vampire fantasy romance and you only want to read a duet, check out Black Sunshine. And last up we have one of the most unhinged duets I've ever read. It is A King of Flesh and Bone. So I have talked about this duet a lot on my channel. Not because I loved it, just because it is so bonkers. But in the story, we are following this girl named Ada, and she lives in a community where the dead do not decay. Instead, they reanimate because the King of Flesh and Bone has decided that he hates humans and he just thinks it's funny. So one day, Ada is trying to bury someone and keep them in the ground, and she ends up being pulled by a zombie, either horse or donkey, to the King of Flesh and Bone's home. Now, humans are not supposed to survive in this realm, so she immediately starts to die. But when the King of Flesh and Bone sees her, he goes, "Oh, human, you will now be my plaything," and just does whatever he wants to her. It is very, very dark. There's some non-con, check trigger warnings. She does not want to be in the position she is in. But as she stays with him, she starts to kind of understand his point of view. And the second book, I will say neither of them are redeemed. It's really mainly our main character, Ada, coming into herself and embracing the darkness. Also, I love to say this in every review where I talk about this book, he breaks her legs twice and never apologizes, like throughout the entire series. He's like, well, if you didn't run away, I wouldn't have broken your legs. So that gives you an idea of how just like ruthless and dark this guy is. But overall, I read both books in a day and a half. So like they kept me entertained, just they're very, very unhinged. All right, guys, those are some of my favorite fantasy romance duets and duologies. Please let me know down in the comments below, what is your absolute favorite fantasy romance or romantasy duet? And I'd like to say a special thank you to my Paladin protectors, Amanda, Lotta, Leslie, Jess, Kat, and Kylie. Thank you guys so much for supporting my channel. And I said this already, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye.